Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. In a year marked by many pivotal votes, the upcoming general election in India, where close to 1 billion people are eligible to cast their ballots, is one to watch. Likely to be held in April or May, these results should give us new insights into the impact of a dramatically younger electorate, new digital campaigning techniques, and an indictment of recent national policy initiatives. We polled 10 journalists to ask, how significant do you believe India's general election will be for global politics? Half said moderately significant, 30% said highly significant, 20% said somewhat significant. We also asked, which of the following factors would have the greatest impact on the election outcome? 40% said charisma and appeal of political leaders, 30% said economic conditions, and 30% said social media and misinformation. Our guest today is Gilles Verniers, a prominent political scientist and commentator with deep expertise in Indian politics and elections. As the former co-director of the Trivedi Center for Political Data at Ashoka University and current senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, Gilles specializes in the analysis of electoral data, political trends, and the dynamics of democratic processes in India. We'll ask him for critical insights into the role of data in understanding voter behavior and the impact of digital campaigns on the election. That's The Briefing. Let's begin.
Let's begin indeed. Welcome to everyone that's joining in online. This is the Global Journalism Seminar. This is a big one, not just because of its size, but for many other reasons in terms of its impact across the world. We're discussing India elections, and I am delighted to have Gilles Verniers. I think we can safely say we've adopted him as Indian, and he can speak with as much sort of passion to any topic that you pick up across India, but more specifically data and how to interpret that while reporting on India. My apologies to you, Gilles, and to the audience in advance. It is also chainsaw season in Oxford, so trees are being trimmed as we speak, and the noise might get quite loud. I will try to speak as loudly and clearly as possible. Gilles, welcome. Thank you for making time for this. Really appreciate you joining in. I wanted to start because I think we might have an audience that is not that familiar with India, but is interested in events there. So I wanted to start with a little bit of context setting. Tell us a little bit about general elections in India, how they're different from the US, because they're quite different, and what we're looking at in terms of the key protagonists in this time's election.
Yeah. So thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to have this conversation with you and your audience today. So, I mean, perhaps the first thing that comes to mind when we think about Indian elections is, the sheer scale. We are getting close to 1 billion registered voters. In this election, India, by definition, breaks its own record every 5 years in terms of sheer size of a democratic exercise. I like to tell my students that in order to organize an Indian election, you need the population of Belgium, which is where I originally come from, to actually organize it. And so that alone, of course, is a remarkable feat, particularly in a country where public infrastructure may be deficient, where public action is not always marked by efficacy. Elections is something that India knows how to organize, and they've done it successfly, in 17 national elections, and they're about to do it again at an even larger scale in the coming weeks and months. The current political landscape is, fairly easy in a way to describe. The BJP is seeking a third consecutive mandate. They hold a thin but yet existing majority in the parliament. They do not have it in the upper house. And it's a key election, obviously, for them. Indian election over the past decades has been characterized by a lot of volatility, a lot of short-lived government, coalition configuration that sort of stabilized the party system in the late 90s and early 2000s. And since 2014, India is in an era of single party dominance, yet again, in its national politics. And so one of the key questions is to see whether this trend of consolidation of a single party in national politics is going to continue, or whether opposition parties and the Congress Party, first among them, will be able to sort of turn down this sort of tide that comes in front of them.
Yeah. And in many ways, as you pointed out as well, the last two terms have become, in a sense, like the US elections, because it's been very much about a vote for one individual rather than so much as a broader party. But, you know, that's the person's standing for election, and the other side is the electorate. And I want to unpack with you some fairly interesting data that came out recently from Pew in terms of their research, in which I think you really get to understand the binaries of the electorate that we're dealing with, where on the one hand, you have very high satisfaction with democracy. That's what the poll turned out. And that's bipartisan. And on the other hand, you also have a belief and endorsement of a strong leader.
Yep.
How do you marry the two?
So indeed, I mean, it's a little bit of, it's a seeming paradox, right? That Mr. Modi has, among democratically elected leader, the highest, popularity rate in the world. I think the Pew survey places it at, 79%. But at the same time, the popularity of the de facto leader of the opposition, Rahul Gandhi, his favorability numbers are also pretty high, right? So it basically tells you that voters can basically recognize the merit of candidates across the board, which I think in itself is interesting. But the popularity of the prime minister does not automatically translate into support for his parties in election, or at least not in equal measure, right? The BJP won in 2019 with 37% of the votes, which is considerably less in a way than, the popularity numbers of Prime Minister Modi, which again tells you that Indian voters may, have a favorable opinion of the prime minister, but they may yet decide however they want to vote in a given election. There was a survey done by CSDS in 2019 that revealed that 25% of BJP voters might have voted for a different party had Mr. Modi not been, the prime minister candidate. So that's one aspect of the question. The second aspect of the question has to do with the popularity or adhesions to the brand of politics that he represents. And surveys, and the Pew survey is not the first one to do so. Actually, many surveys over the past 10 years indicate that there's a growing appetite in India for a strong form of rule. The one very puzzling result in the survey is the number of Indians who seem to think that the army would do a good job at governing in a country where the army has always stayed clear from domestic politics. Right. And again, it's kind of difficult to square that piece of information with the degree of satisfaction with the current government, right? If the voters are by and large satisfied with the government, the prime minister, why would they aspire for some sort of military rule, right? So these things are not easy to square. I think we can do that by sort of measuring the growing appetite for a form of rule that is embodied in an individual, for a form of power, of political power that is concentrated, a form of power that also gives a sense of unique purpose and direction to the country. There seems to be a lot of resonance for those ideas.
Let's talk about what the planks have been, though, in the past. A lot of this sort of hangs in the surface, as you say, and is quite visible to many. However, if you were to assess the ruling party at this point, the BJP, and Prime Minister Modi himself, his campaign in 2019, for instance, was working on pillars of national security, nationalism, welfareism, something he created personal connections, to himself with on all three strands. Would you say that would remain the plank going into the elections this year, or would it be a different model?
So we yet to see, what the BJP campaign will be about. I mean, we can imagine that, the Ram Temple will be one of the achievements that they will advertise. In 2014, when they came to power, the argument was, cleaning up the system, reviving a declining economy, bringing to power a CEO, chief minister who understands the economy, who has strong ties with the corporate world, and who will, pursue pragmatic, politics to, push India's growth and so forth. And that discourse sort of was left aside in 2019, where, as you said, the campaign was fought around the overall theme of protection. Protection of the nation, protection of the territory with Pakistan, protection of the poor, protection of women, the image of Mr. Modi as, the chokidar, the guard, the guardian, for the country, as some sort of a father, providential figure, the one who provides, benefits, state benefits to the people, quite literally through, welfare and redistributive policies. And it was in a way itself an indication that, the first rhetoric had not sort of been matched by results. And the centrality of welfare, for example, in electoral campaign, reveals that, welfare is seen as, fundamentally a compensatory mechanism for what India's growth is not delivering to people. And so it's likely that Mr. Modi will continue to campaign on these issues, because not only it enables him to present himself as, the great provider, the generous providential leader, it really puts him personally, individually at the center of everything. And we know, and there is data to support that the Modi factor makes a significant difference in terms of performance for the BJP.
How do you navigate something like Ayodhya as an event when you're trying to report on the general national politics of the country, Gilles? Because it's not, there's no model to fall back on. This is a new one, as you say, for a prime minister to be openly associated with a temple, inaugurating the temple. We don't have a Hindu model that we can fall back on where we have experience of how things were. And the second part of my question is, how do you think that temple project will impact voting patterns? Do you think it will make only an incremental change, if at all? Do you think it'll make a big impact? Or do you think that those who would intend to vote a certain way, in this case for the BJP, would have voted in any case? This sort of bolsters the case for them.
Yeah. So first of all, I think we can say that the inauguration of the temple is a culminating moment rather than a turning point. We've seen Prime Minister Modi officiate as, India's unofficial head priest in religious ceremonies across the countries, or public displays of devotion have been a feature of his image building political communication. But of course, in the case of the temple, it's the culmination of a very long political campaign and a key moment in an effort at redefining the terms of India as a nation, the very definition of India as a nation, the affirmation or the assertion of India as basically a Hindu power. And the ceremony was designed as a demonstration of power, right? If you look at the guest list, you had Bollywood actors, you had billionaires, you had social media influencers, and so basically the vital force of the country.
Defense personnel, as you said, for the first time ever. So
No, exactly. And with, the prime minister as a priestly figure in the center, of it all. And so obviously it bears tremendous, symbolic importance. It basically shows that, India for the moment has, left the idea of secularism quite far behind. It is part of a larger project of asserting India as a new, Hindu civilizational power. And so that's a key element into that. The Pew survey that you mentioned shows that there's wide acceptability for this mixing of religion and politics. In many ways, it's a measure of how India has changed. 30 years ago, when the Babri Masjid was demolished, there was widespread condemnation within India. And I'm not quite sure that the event would have been received so, warmly, enthusiastically, maybe 10 years ago, or certainly not 20 years ago. So it is also indicative of, profound change. How is it going to affect the election? It's hard to say. It's very hard to predict. What we know of electoral behavior in India is that people don't vote on a single issue. They look at a variety of factors and make their choices accordingly. It's hard not to think that it's not going to create a further advantage, or that it does not consolidate Mr. Modi's image and popularity. But in terms of predicting, precisely how the impact is going to have on voting, we simply don't have really the data for that.
Yeah. I want to shift focus for a bit on the key opposition. At this point, for general elections, we are talking about the Congress. One point of view was that the BJP does very well in general elections, but is not that great a player in state elections. As we speak, the BJP now has its own state government in 12 states, most recently in very large core Hindi heartland states. And I quote from a piece that you wrote yourself assessing election outcomes in Chhattisgarh, saying the Chhattisgarh election produced perhaps the most surprising result of this poll season. The Congress government, led by Bhupesh Baghel, seemed poised for re-election after a term marked by strong investment in welfare schemes, agriculture subsidies, but the Congress lost to a resurgent BJP that scored its best ever performance in the state in terms of seats. And this is sort of echoing of what a large part of the reportage at that point was as well, that in these three states, the Congress had a very good, if not fighting chance. Are journalists not being able to read on-ground developments accurately? Or is something else happening within even the state dynamics that we should draw lessons from for the general elections?
Couple of things. First of all, if you look at the Congress Party, they do have the ability of squandering their own chances by either taking elections a little bit too lightly, by not working hard enough, by forgetting to campaign between elections, something that the BJP does permanently. And so by not addressing issues of factionalism, internal divisions, which may break down or weaken the party during a state election or a general election. So, I mean, part of the story has to do with Congress Party or the opposition's own weaknesses. There's another part of the story which I don't think gets covered enough, which is that India no longer has free and fair competition. When we talk about free and fair elections, we refer to essentially two things. One is free and fairness of the conduct of the election. And I still think that India has satisfactorily free and fair elections in the way they are conducted by the ECI, by the Election Commission. But there's also an element of free and fair competition, right? Not having one party concentrate, 80% of the resources injected into, political funding. Not having one party dominate, the media sphere to the extent that, the BJP does. Not having a party in power at the center that uses or misuses state institutions to create legal complications to opposition leaders and the opposition in general. or not having a party in power that cracks down on civil liberties and academic freedom, freedom of press, and literally attacks those who speak up or speak against or speak critically about the government. And so there's a lot of sort of practices that we've seen that have been in India for a while, but that have really exacerbated over the past few years, that when you put them together, amount to, as many breaches of democratic norms that prevent India from having, a level playing field for parties. And so in this election, as in the state election that you mentioned just before, there is a strong element of unfair competition that structurally disadvantage the opposition, which again suffers from its own issues, right? But it gets, of course, compounded by the fact that the BJP accumulates all kinds of advantages that include means that are democratically dubious, and some of them probably should be illegal. Just to give you an example, the BJP has brought down 5 democratically elected state government ever since 2014. At the top of my head, in Manipur, in Goa, in Karnataka, in Madhya Pradesh, and in Maharashtra, where it sort of cannibalized opposition parties, engineered a split of the NCP, brought down the coalition government, and took power. So that's a pretty big democratic norm, to accept the result and not seek to undo an electoral outcome at the first opportunity through really dubious means, because we know that MPs and MLAs are getting bought to basically bring down their own governments, their own majorities.
What would you double down on going into the general elections as, 3 or 4 core areas to focus on if you were reporting on this, Gilles? If you were looking at it with a journalistic lens, which one would you pick up? Because as you said, funding is huge. There is now more drama around the electoral bonds issue, which, for viewers who may not know, this was finally struck down by the Supreme Court after being 7 years in existence, where essentially individuals and corporates could anonymously donate to a particular party. As the details were provided, a large chunk of that, nearly 3/4, was going to the BJP, of course. But the demand from the Supreme Court was to make those details public, which the banks in charge now say they cannot do till probably voting has been done and votes have been counted. So that's one. But there's so many others that you raise. What are the 2 or 3 things you would really drill down on in terms of keen reportage?
Yeah. So first of all, I would stay away from the silly game of predictions. What we know of electoral behavior is that the Indian voters tend to change their vote between elections to a higher degree. There's data that supports it from Pradeep Chiber and Francisca Jensenius, looking at polling booth data that shows that between a quarter and a third of voters change party between from one general election to another, which is huge, which is considerable, right? And so for a number of reasons that, we can, detail perhaps later, I think Indian voters are resistant to any kind of predictive model. So we can, I think, stay clear of, the usual guess game, and perhaps focus on the rules of the game, and whether these rules, remain, being vigilant about whether these rules remain free and fair. The Supreme Court ruling that you mentioned about the electoral bonds was, of course, welcomed, right? But it could create the impression that, electoral funding is fixed. It's very, very far from it. In many ways, the judgment does not substitute the electoral bond system by another system. So for all practical purpose, we go from, the recent opaque system, and we go back to the old opaque system, the money bags and everything. And so being vigilant about, the rules of the game, and whether, the instrumentalization of institutions. Just a few weeks ago, the accounts of the Congress parties were frozen by the IT department, the income tax department, on a completely, flimsical, filing issues. In a functioning democracy, you don't freeze the accounts of main opposition parties weeks before a general elections. Parties are spending the money now, right? And so how institutions are reacting. Most of these, lawsuits, be it the defamation case against Rahul Gandhi or and I mean, most of these cases eventually sort of get overturned, right? The Congress party, the tax tribunal sort of gave back Congress control over his accounts. And so all these attempts at breaking democratic norms need to be documented. They need to be, paid attention. We need to pay attention to them. And also look at, opposition dynamics, but through the angle of its various components seeking their self-interest, right? The India coalition hasn't taken up largely because of their inability to imagine a common program or imagine, a common narrative that they can bring to voters, but also, and most importantly, because regional parties are not ready to trade their regional position for an elusive, very elusive, victory in the general election. And so looking at what institutions are doing, looking at, the underhanded aspects of the campaign, there's always a visible campaign and there's an invisible campaign. And the invisible campaign is largely fought on social media and is basically, reveals more what parties are about than what they may say about welfare, about inclusion, about India's resurgence and so forth. There's really good work that's being done analyzing the content of social media, of WhatsApp group particularly, which are a major instrument of political communication. And the results of that, are quite surprising. When we imagine, we tend to sort of fantasize or imagine that, there's a ton of hateful comments that goes into there, that communalizes voter, that polarizes. But in fact, the bulk of content has to do with, societal issues. It has to do with religious content that sort of indirectly, support, the BJP's larger, worldview. But does not necessarily match with the kind of idea that we can have. And finally, maybe what is at stake here is not so much which parties are going to get how many seats, but it's what is the vision, what is the broader vision of India, what is the political project that different parties incarnate. Is it an India that is secular, that is plural, that or is it India as a resurgent Hindu nation? When we look at all these political practices, dubious political practices, which have existed in India for a long time, I mean, corruption, defections, and so forth, the instrumentalization of institution, what makes the period in which we are now significant is that these practices are put at the service of not just winning election, but carrying a particular political project, which is a project that has been literally 100 years, in the making, a vision of India as a Hindu state, as a Hindu nation. And so paying attention to, to those signals, right? Beyond what, beyond party manifestos that most people don't read, beyond, the catalog of promises and policies and welfare redistribution schemes that, either side, may propose. What is the larger vision, right? And speak to ordinary voters to see and try to figure out how and why it resonates so much, right?
And if I were to play devil's advocate and push back on that and say, some of what the focus is on seems to be what the larger perception is working, which is, as you said, welfareism, where any number of schemes, and I admit existing schemes, were renamed with the prime minister's name ahead of them, but the connection was created in a way that was very direct, where the grains or the food or the cooking gas was going, in the name of the prime minister to the person benefiting from it. A very, very high profile foreign policy, something India has never seen before, where it's largely been quite discreet, quite, under the radar, and much more focused on diplomacy, where it seems now to be a more aggressive stance in terms of foreign policy. And the third one, the women voters, Gilles, who time and again are referred to as the Labharthis, for the ones who are getting benefits from the government, and the fact that they are voting in very large numbers for this government. How would you respond to sort of those three bullet points: welfareism, high-profile foreign policy, and a large female voting base?
Yeah. So welfareism is clearly a key instrument to create a direct link between leadership and voters. I mean, that's the hallmark of populist leadership. You basically get rid of all kinds of intermediaries, parties, elected representative institutions, the bureaucracy, public administration, and so forth. And in a way, the distribution of material goods, bags of grain or rice or whichever, or ration cards or vaccine certificates, are great political communication support because they can be branded, with or labeled with, the face of the leader. Again, this is not new. I mean, this was a hallmark of Jayalalitha's style of politics in Tamil Nadu. It's been a feature of regional politics where chief ministers seek to sort of attribute the distribution of state benefits to their own person. And now it is done at a scale that is unprecedented. And that, again, contributes to create an undue advantage because the party in power and Mr. Modi rely on the state machinery as an electoral prop. It's always useful to remember that Indira Gandhi's elections was invalidated for what appears today an absolutely, minor breach of the norm that you don't use state resources for electoral gain. Here, the state itself becomes, a partisan actor. But it's also a necessary plank because of the state of the economy, right? The government itself, in a rare admission, admitted that millions and millions, dozens of millions of Indians are reliant on food distribution and would go back to dire poverty if they were not supported that way. So it does also play a key role in keeping people out of complete poverty. But the fact that it's still necessary is testimony about the state of the economy, the state of unequal distribution of resources, and in India and so forth. What was the second?
Foreign policy.
Yeah, foreign policy. Yes, that is a major shift. We completely out of the old paradigm according which state and domestic politics, foreign and domestic politics was sort of separated. There were bridges, but they were specific on issues. Now, foreign policy is a key argument that the BJP does, that Mr. Modi does to its audience at home. And again, foreign policy is also used to craft the image of India and the prime minister in a rather new way. It's not just about India playing its own geopolitical advantage or playing its demographic weight advantage on the international scale. It's about the assertion of India as a major power, as a major civilizational power. It's about reclaiming rights on the international stage. And so it's the style, I mean, it's in keeping with, the political style adopted abroad, adopted, at home. Very top down, the projection of very decisive leadership, a certain dose of, aggressiveness, which leads India to, take steps that it probably did, staging foreign assassinations of opponents on foreign soils, and things like this. And so all this plays very well to a domestic audience, and so domestic and foreign policies are deeply, deeply intertwined. Think about the role of the airstrikes on Pakistan just weeks before the 2019 elections. That definitely gave them quite a bump. On women voters, I mean, this is a fascinating issue because India's always had a strong gap of participation between men and women, between 15 to 20% in the first decades, and that gap of participation between men and women very, very slowly reduced. But after 2009, before the rise of the BJP, before the victory of the BJP in 2014, that gap actually closed, and now we have women outvoting men in 24 states out of 30, which does not mean, of course, that there are more women voting than men, because you have fewer women in the population and therefore in the electorate, and there's still some registration gap. But women have demonstrated their ability to tilt the election by voting preferentially for a particular party. So now it does not necessarily or automatically goes to the BJP. We've seen women making a significant difference in electoral outcome in Delhi, where they massively supported Aam Aadmi Party, in West Bengal, where they massively supported the Trinamool. But it is true that the BJP has succeeded in recent years at consolidating or closing the gap of support from women that it used to suffer from. And that's essentially done through welfare redistribution scheme that target women individually. So there's been a conscious effort in order to woo women voters. I have to say that it's not translating into political representation yet, despite the fact that they voted the women reservation bill, but delayed its implementation. They're not feeling incentivized to provide more representations to women. But that, beyond the usual, patriarchal explanation, it's in keeping with the idea that representation no longer really matters. It's really all about the leadership. And as long as people get what they need, they should feel contented. They should not necessarily seek to get a slice of power for themselves. And so all these efforts to attract women votes does not lead to any significant increase in their representation.
It's a good segue to lean into the questions that are coming in. And I think this one picks up from the point you were just making in terms of some pockets where it hasn't worked. There's a question that's coming from Sankar Narayan Sudalai, who says, what's your opinion on Modi or BJP's South-focused campaigns? Will it work? And I know there's been a lot of high-profile talk about this North-South divide building within India.
Yeah. So, I mean, we know that the South has, by and large, barring Karnataka, the South, by and large, has, eluded the BJP. In fact, just to broaden the question a little bit, if we look at what are the spaces or what are the states where the BJP has failed so far to penetrate or expand or win elections, these are states that are usually governed by regionalist parties that incarnate, defend, embody a strong regional identity that cuts across cleavages, and that offers them a narrative that they can use to counter the national narrative or the nationalist narrative of the BJP, which in their mind is largely associated with a North Indian vision of things, right? It's Hindi, it's Hindu, it's North India, it's Hindi belt. And that remains, of course, the seat of power of the BJP. And so my guess is that as long as the BJP continues to incarnate from a southern perspective, a northern political force rather than a national political force, or a political force that is compatible with, the political cultures, in the South and political identities in the South, that the South is going to continue to elude them. The welfare argument does not really work because the southern states perform much better than the rest of the country in terms of, efficacy of public action, efficacy of, public delivery, welfare schemes, and so forth. And so all those arguments also are not, are not very effective. These southern states also have, a healthy, competitive stage of their own. So people do have alternatives. It's not that they have either the party in power or the BJP. And so the BJP is yet to, impose itself as, the number two force even in those states and become, a challenge. Even a party like the AADMK that seemed to be, dying has rejected, the idea of an alliance with the BJP in Tamil Nadu. So if I were to risk, prediction, I would say that the prospect of the BJP are not very good. But at the same time, they're playing a very long game, right? And so they are testing constantly new strategies on the ground. They focus on municipal elections. The BJP is a party that, we see the BJP as this sort of centralized pyramid led by, two, maybe three individuals, but it used to be a party that grew from the ground, from the first municipal election, then state election, then national election. And so they are nonetheless investing a lot of resources into building capacity, but that's a rather long game, well beyond, I think, the scope of this coming election.
I'm going to switch to the room now where our global journalist fellows are waiting with lots of questions. And there are so many fantastic questions coming online as well. I'm going to try and fit in as much as possible. So let's go with Fran and then Patricia and then Omar. If you could start with your question and then you can pass the mic around.
Hi, how are you? Is the microphone working?
It is.
I can hear you, yes.
Hi. You mentioned the restrictions to the freedom of the press, and I was wondering how effective those policies have been in recent years to stop criticism and increase Mr. Modi's popularity.
Sorry, are you talking about civil liberties?
Sorry?
Sorry, I could not understand the question very clearly.
I can paraphrase if that's okay, Fran. The question is, how effective have the restrictions that we've seen on the freedom of press been in terms of actually stopping criticism for Narendra Modi and for the party at large?
Well, I'd say they've been very effective, right? Generally, it's not a surprise, and you know that better than we do, that journalism is a very risky, proposition and very risky profession in India, particularly more so for Indian journalists who face, the danger of arrest and detention, but also for foreign correspondents. A friend of mine and a colleague of yours recently was, expelled from India after serving 23 years as a foreign correspondent. So I think it has, from the point of view of the BJP, it has the desired chilling effect. And we see the media in India as being growingly partisan or uncritical. You have pockets of journalism independence, but the journalists who work in those spaces are face considerable risks. legal harassment being, one of them. I think The Wire must have lost count of the number of cases that have been thrown against them, both as a group, but also individually, right? So the cost is also, individual. And so that has, a chilling effect. I wrote about the 2019 election, and I wrote that, the BJP rose to power by creating its own channels of communication, essentially through social media, its own TV channels, its own, it created its own media, and basically sort of cut the grass under the feet of traditional media. They were no longer a necessary intermediary between parties and voters. They were made basically redundant, and so a lot of them adapted to that and then started beating the drum for the government. And so spaces for an independent practice of journalism have considerably reduced.
Patricia.
My question is about how the triangle of power between US and China and India can be affected by the cast of this changes between those powers can be affected by outcomes of elections, and whether the Modi and winning political power in India can change its narrative toward competition between Biden and Trump, and how particularly can it change when after the possible Trump win? Thank you.
Yeah. So with regard to the geopolitical situation, I mean, we're a bit in a strange situation because obviously India plays its, geopolitical advantage, as much as it can. And of course, she's totally entitled, to do so. It's, I mean, the threat of China is one of the key reasons, why, India's importance has, grown in recent years. But at the same time, India's foreign policy doctrine sort of prevents it from, forming alliances, right? It has partnerships, it has strategic partnerships, it has cooperations, including military cooperation with a number of powers, including France or Australia or Japan or obviously the United States. But it doesn't do alliances, right? It always keeps for itself the possibility of, shifting its policies according to its own interest. And so that creates an element of instability and unpredictability in what, India will do. And India also has the practice of sort of, segmenting, foreign policy. So it may cooperate, with a power on a particular issue, but it will oppose the same power on a different issue, right? Climate change negotiation being, a case in point. Or these, rapprochement between the US and India. I mean, it was thought from an American perspective that this would lead to, further, deeper military cooperation, contracts, defense procurement, etc. And the fact is that it hasn't, because India will keep buying from whatever it wants, from whoever it wants, whenever it wants, regardless of, these larger, geopolitical considerations. And so it makes India a country, an uneasy partner in many ways. Now, with regard to the American election, there are affinities, obviously, between Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump, right? That an affinity that does not have quite the same level with Joe Biden. But the reality is that India will accommodate itself of whoever comes to power. It practically endorsed Donald Trump before the last American elections through major public events both in India and in the US. But that did not prevent it from working, with the Democrats once they were elected. We are in a situation where the world is courting India rather than the other way around, right? And so that's also a source of confidence for India, and that in part, accounts for, its self-confidence, its aggressiveness, its ability to assert itself, on the global stage.
Omar.
Okay. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm Omar from Burkina Faso. So my question, I have two major questions. The first one is, what is the danger of Indian democracy while we know that secularity is being pushed back and Hinduism as a state religion is being kind of institutionalized. And I've tried to get information about how many terms a president can run in India, but it's very confused. So some says 2 terms of 5 years, some says indefinite. And in the history, Dr. Rajendra Prasad was the first to be elected, 2 in the round. That's something that I read. I don't know if it's true. So do you see Modi giving back the seat after 2 terms, or he will rule ad vitam aeternam as what is kind of looking to be in this narrative of China with Xi Jinping?
Yeah. So I'll address the second question first, because the answer is pretty easy. So India is still a parliamentary system and not a presidential system, even though it has adopted a lot of features of a presidential system recently, which means that there are no term limits, right? Jawaharlal Nehru was a prime minister for 16 years, or 16 years. Indira Gandhi was a prime minister for 12 years, perhaps more. And so there are no limits. I mean, there are natural limits. I mean, Mr. Modi is 74, which in Indian politics is still, quite young. So, and so he could go on. We know that one of his own personal objectives and dream is to serve longer than Jawaharlal Nehru. He wants to be India's longest serving prime minister. So that gives you a hint as of when he might, go on voluntary retirement at some point or not. My guess would be not before it clicks, 16 years. And I mean, he's done 10 years already. Right. So that's that. What was your first question?
I think it was generally the same question, essentially asking, can he stand for another term? And I think the short answer is yes, which he is. This is his 3rd term. So
no, but the first question was about basically democratic decline
the danger
and secularism. See, that's the key question, right? India's rise on the international stage takes place at the same time as its democratic decline. And what made India an exceptional power in the past was the fact that it was emerging as a major global power, as a democracy. Right now, there seems to be, a disconnect between the two, or a dissonance between the two, rather than a disconnect. Right, and so as India grows on the international stage, it actually grows also more and more authoritarian at home, and so the consequences, the implications are, really wide-reaching. It also speaks to the ability of India, to sort of fashion itself as, spokesperson for, the global South, right? India has occupied, in a way, that role in the past, under the non-alignment movement, but it did so not so much as a great power, but it did so as a great moral power, right? That was the spirit of, the non-alignment and Jawaharlal Nehru. Clearly, today the perspective has changed, and we see India, presenting itself as, spokesperson or leader of the global South. But the question that remains unanswered in my mind is, who exactly in the global South is following India, given the fact that India first and foremost follows its own self-interest, right? So that these are the terms of the equation.
And I was going to say 74 years is now not that old for the US elections either, Gilles. So the bar, bar is moving. I think we have time for one question, and it's important, and I want to sort of layer another question to it, which is coming from Hamad Sarfaraz, and he says the BJP's utilization of social media and image politics has been quite remarkable. Do
Yeah.
you foresee any political party emerging as a significant challenger to its digital campaign? I want to layer that with a recent report by the World Economic Forum saying misinformation and disinformation are the two biggest challenges this year, within which India is right on top in terms of being a country at risk. Do you see that as the biggest problem for India? And to answer the first part of the question asked, do you see technology within which social media chat platforms, as you alluded to earlier, have been a truly sort of driving force in building support for the party?
Yeah. So we've seen it's not a new issue that, misinformation, disinformation have been, a key component of political communication strategies and political practice, in general. India has grappled with, WhatsApp rumors that have led to murders and lynching and so forth. So the issue is very serious. India now is also a net contributor of global misinformation, right? It's not just destined to an audience, at home, but a lot of misinformation about Israel and Palestine conflict actually originates, from India itself. I think what we're not measuring, because it's still nascent technology, is the impact of AI, the protection of deepfakes on campaign. We have anecdotal evidence that it's already being put to use. Sometimes in rather sort of innocuous forms, right? They are reviving dead politicians. Some parties are reviving dead politicians to make contemporary speeches, which is kind of strange. But there's no telling how technology can be used or abused for political gains. There is a particularly effective marriage of sort of a traditional form of ethnic and religious nationalism and enhanced by technology. So, for example, for the inauguration of the Ram Temple, engineers built a virtual Ram Temple on Meta, and with the proper gear or equipment, you could actually navigate that space. And so the use of technology does not only expand the reach that parties have, but it lends itself some degree of legitimacy to the content itself, right? You trust it because it comes from some tech enhanced mechanism. And so it is a key issue. At the same time, it's not yet a substitute for conventional forms of campaigning, right? Boots on the ground, door to door, knocking and mobilizing voters, locally. And this is where the BJP has, again, considerable competitive advantage, is the sheer number of people willing to volunteer, for its campaign. Numbers are staggering. In 2019, they had nearly 900,000 volunteers on the ground doing, day-to-day campaigning, including, last minute, knocking at doors to push, people from, for voting. And so I see, social media, this communication strategy as yet another way for the BJP to saturate the public sphere with its image and the image of the prime minister. But it's one means among others, and we should not lose sight of the other means as well.
No, not at all. And amongst other things, it might also be, Gilles, one of the most expensive election campaigns that we have seen in recent histories, I think. 2019 broke a lot of records, but by all indications, that as well is going to be pierced this year. Gilles, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being so generous with all your insight. This is, as I said, going to be a big one and perhaps even a pivotal one in terms of what it defines for the region generally, but for democracy at large. Thank you very much. Very appreciative of all your time today from all of us here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to everyone that's tuned in. We will see you again at the next seminar, of course, from the Reuters team. Goodbye. Thank you.